20 minutes after 11 o'clock Central African time, and the big story making international headlines at this hour is coming out of Sri Lanka. The President and Prime Minister there have now agreed to step down, but only next week. The announcement comes a day after violent protests where demonstrators ended up storming the presidential palace. The protesters are blaming the government of the day for the country's worst economic crisis in 7 decades. For more on this, let's bring in Thusiyan Nandakumar, who's editor-in-chief at the Tamil Guardian. He joins us now via our video link this morning. Thusiyan, it's great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for making time. So this is what protesters have been calling for a long time, quite frankly. Not only the resignation of the Prime Minister and the President, but the entire government. Will this move go far enough, do you think, in quelling the unrest?
Well, I think that is the question on everyone's mind. So Sri Lanka's been in a state of economic crisis for several months now, and it's been really worsening. Now, the blame has fallen at the president's door, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. I think it's important to announce that there's been no official word from him yet. He hasn't actually said that he will renounce. He will resign. So we're still waiting to hear from the president. We don't actually even know where he is at this moment in time. However, it still remains to be seen whether all of Sri Lanka's ills will be resolved by the resignation of some men at the head of government. I think what we need is a deeper rooted and more systemic change, something that will really help alleviate the economic crisis day to day, because it looks like there's still going to be a lot of pain ahead for everyone across the islands.
What demonstrators appear to be calling for is political reform, but they're facing an economic crisis. To what extent do you reckon what they're calling for will directly resolve in the material change of the experience that they're currently having, the worst crisis, as we're being told, in 7 decades?
Well, yes, I think a lot of the protesters are placing the blame pretty much on the Rajapaksa's door. The Rajapaksa regime has been in power for several years now. They've been accused of corruption and economic mismanagement, but I think it's also important to note that they're accused of horrific war crimes and even committing a genocide in the northeast of Tamils there. Now, it still remains to be seen whether removing these figureheads will actually change the economic and political system on the island. What's actually needed is a deeper power structure change, devolution of powers to the northeast, and actually a new political culture of accountability and transparency, which will actually allow the island to prosper economically and also regain some of this international trust that's been lost with the Rajapaksas. Whether that will happen, we've got a long way to go. I mean, last night's events were in some ways revolutionary. We've never before seen pictures like this of people swimming in the president's private pool or working out in his gym. However, we're just at the tip of the iceberg. Rajapaksa is a man who was nicknamed the Terminator for his ruthless, mass atrocities that he committed. So we're not over yet, if that makes sense.
One wonders whether even the Terminator can survive this, especially because of what we've seen take place. I mean, as you were describing those scenes, we actually have visuals playing, just to remind our viewers of just how unprecedented the situation is in Sri Lanka at the moment. Yes, this had been for quite some time, but it almost feels like yesterday was kind of the culmination of the frustration over the years, and symbolically sends quite a strong message, really, to the leaders of the day.
Yes, but I think it's also important to note that just 2.5 years ago, Gotabaya won democratic elections with a resounding majority amongst the Sinhalese ethnic majority down south in the Sinhala heartlands. He was seen as a Sinhala Buddhist war hero, as an ethno-nationalist, as someone who would bring Sri Lanka to the state that they wanted to. Now, this is a massive change in popularity for him. So that is certainly unprecedented, but it doesn't mean we've quite changed the political culture or the system of the island yet. So there's definitely a long way to go, but this is obviously a very encouraging first step.
Typically, when there's this kind of mass uprising, the military is expected to play some kind of role. Do we know what the sentiment on the ground, as it were, is towards the military in Sri Lanka, and whether or not the country is facing a prospect of some kind of transitional period under military rule?
So I think that's the fear that everyone has. The military in Sri Lanka plays a massive role in everyday life, particularly in the Tamil North and East. Military spending is one of the biggest spending budgets within the Sri Lankan government expenditure. And Sri Lanka actually has one of the largest militaries in the region when you compare it per capita. Now, the military itself was previously very closely aligned to the Rajapaksas. There are a lot of Rajapaksa allies in senior parts of the military. And the military is also accused of mass atrocities and genocide too. So there's a real fear that a military takeover may come. It hasn't happened in Sri Lanka's past before, but with the fact that the military being so closely aligned to the Rajapaksas, and we know that they're capable of committing some horrific rights abuses, the fear is still around.
Yeah, it might be still too early, but I guess worth asking. the Rajapaksas have had such a strong hold over the country for so many years. Has Sri Lanka been able to imagine a world, a year, without the Rajapaksas running the country? In other words, it's my very roundabout way of asking, who do the people who are demonstrating think is best placed to replace Rajapaksa if he were to step down?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think there was a period of time between 2015 and 2019 where the Rajapaksas were briefly out of power as well. So there are other options. I think the issue is, are we actually going to have someone who will bring about a new style of politics, a new political culture to the country? The Rajapaksa style of politics is very populist, very ethno-nationalist, very militarized, but also brings in those elements of racism, of mismanagement and corruption, of impunity. What we need is someone who can break that and actually change the whole governance structure. That is going to be a lot more difficult to find if and when the Rajapaksas do step down. And also, will the new leadership hold the Rajapaksas accountable? They're accused of lots and lots of mass atrocities and many other financial crimes. So are we simply going to get Gotabaya to go home, or are we going to hold him accountable and put him in trial somewhere as well? There are lots of very important questions that need to be answered by whoever comes in charge next.
Yeah, and you know, we can cite multiple examples of leaders of countries that are facing an economic crisis, quite frankly living in exile. Who are Rajapaksa's friends, do you think, in the region where he might seek refuge if the situation ever gets there? I mean, you've already mentioned, for one, we currently don't know where he is.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very good question. I think that's really limited Rajapaksa's options. Now, the initial protests were about Gotabaya going home to America, where he once held citizenship. But actually, there's also fear amongst Gotabaya's allies that if he goes to America, because of his history of war crimes and genocide, he may actually face trial or be put in prison. And that's the same for many other Western countries. One of Sri Lanka's top generals was actually barred from entry to the US over his role in executing Tamils and committing war crimes. So there's a real fear that there's a few other Sri Lankan names may be barred from entry to the US, despite Gotabaya once having held citizenship there. Whether they can flee to India or not, it's still not known. Tamil Nadu is just a few short miles away, 40 miles away from Sri Lanka, across the Port Strait, but there's 60 to 70 million Tamils there, and I'm not sure Gotabaya would be fleeing there. What did happen a few months ago, though, was Mahinda Rajapaksa fled to the Tamil northeast when he was facing protests and stayed inside a military base for some time, where there is a massive military occupation. So whether he's hiding somewhere in the northeast, whether he's fled abroad, no one really knows yet. China is always another possibility. Middle Eastern countries have been raised, but we're still waiting to find out where exactly Gotabaya is.
Sure. Not to make light of a very serious situation, but I imagine a lot of the conversations last night were around who got an opportunity to swim in the president's pool. For now, thanks very much indeed. Really do appreciate your speaking to us around this incredibly important issue in Sri Lanka. Thusiyan Nandakumar, beg your pardon, editor-in-chief at the Tamil Guardian, live to us from London. Once again, thanks very much indeed.